Okay, very good. So it's now on my watch, at least, it's 1 minute past 3 p.m. So we're almost on time. I'm very happy to welcome all of you back to the third and final panel addressing trans-regional challenges in North Africa. We will focus on smuggling, terrorism, migration, how fuzzy the boundaries are between these three potentially. And we will definitely also tie in a lot of links to other parts of Africa. I think that's inherent in this panel. And it's also something that our keynote speaker, George Hudson from the FCO already noted this morning. So I'm excited to see how our panelists are going to address these parts. Overall, this panel is part of our one-day conference of the Institute of Middle Eastern Studies here at King's College London. It's our annual conference and we're focusing on North Africa this year, hence the title, Navigating North Africa in 2020, Dominating Narratives and New Perspectives. For the next 90 minutes, so this is how long our third panel is going to be, from 3 p.m. until 4:30. We have 4 presentations lined up. All 4 of them sound very exciting. And we have the director of the Institute of Middle Eastern Studies, Professor Jonathan Hill, who's going to chair the panel. So I am very happy to hand over to him for now. I would just have one final housekeeping remark. And we really encourage to have an audience engagement so far with the first 2 panels that worked really well. And we encourage the participants to use the Q&A box to ask their questions. It can be anonymous, and then the chair will work through these questions. Use the Q&A box rather than the chat box. And with that, over to Jonathan Hill.
Great, thank you very much, Inga. And it's wonderful to be back and for the third and final panel of today's and this year's conference for the Institute of Middle Eastern Studies. The title of today's panel is Trans-Regional Threats and Challenges, Terrorism, Migration and Smuggling. And as Inga said, this panel is looking a little bit southwards and looking at some of the connections and links that exist between the countries of the Maghreb and wider North Africa and those in the Sahel and sub-Saharan Africa. I am delighted, very excited to be hosting this panel as almost 12 years ago today, in fact, I moved to Nigeria for 18 months and was there from the end of 2007 to the summer of 2009. And I left just before the infamous Battle of Maiduguri, when Boko Haram, the now infamous Nigerian terrorist group, emerged as a fighting force in Nigeria and the wider West African Sahel region. Today's papers, all of today's papers, look at themes connected to the sorts of issues and questions that Boko Haram has raised, from the effectiveness of states through to transnational smuggling networks, to the kind of instability that Libya's collapse as a state has had on the wider region. So I'll be very interested to hear what they've got to say. Just to reiterate what Inga said, please send through any questions or comments you might have through the Q&A function at the bottom. I will be delighted to read those out as best I can at the end. We will proceed in the order that is outlined in the program. So we're going to start off with Dr. Dalia Ghanem, who is a resident scholar at the Carnegie Middle East Center in Beirut. And she is going to present on At the Edges of the State. If you are ready, Dalia, if you've got any slides to share with us at all?
Hi, hi everyone. Thank you, Jonathan, for that. Yes, I have actually a PowerPoint that I am going to share with you.
Super.
Here we go. Let us put it here. So yes, going to, can you see it?
Yes.
Can you, yes. Do you see the PowerPoint?
Yes, it's
Okay.
it's not in slideshow mode, but we can see the slides.
Okay, perfect. So when I'm going to discuss the Algerian-Tunisian border, actually. So when discussing, of course, the borders, especially in North Africa, it is very hard not to hear terrorism, drugs, weapon, and of course, smuggling. In this presentation, I will discuss smuggling, but not with the usual cliches that we have and that we hear about in many circles. This does not mean that I am going to overlook the disruptiveness of these phenomena. It is merely actually a shift of vision, vision that sees the borderlands trade on its terrain with its historical trajectory and complex dynamics. The borderland that I am going to discuss is this one. So basically, I did my fieldwork in Algeria, but also in Tunisia. So I went from Algiers. I went approximately 700 kilometers from Algiers in the northeast of Algeria, in the region of Mdawrouch, El Wenzat, Bissa, Bir Later, and I end up in Qasrin in Tunisia. And I studied actually the smuggling activities of young people between the two borders. So in the borderlands, what is very important to keep in mind, and I would think this is my main argument, is that these are special places. There is a complex social system where the formal and the documented coexist with the informal and the undocumented. Everyday life strategies and tactics connect these two antagonistic level structures and opposing parties. While the former component is represented by state institutions, border police, customs, gendarmerie, and territorial markers such as passport control, trenches, etc., the informal element is represented by smugglers. It is represented by sellers of smuggled product. It is represented by lookouts, by drivers who do not have legal status, though they have a significant direct and indirect impact on state border functioning. So in the paper that, and in the series of papers that I wrote recently for Carnegie Middle East Center and the X-Border project regarding the Tunisian-Algeria borderland, I deconstruct the image of the smugglers as criminals and state authorities as representatives of law and order. Smugglers, sellers, customs officer, all these actors are linked by the twinned and intertwined ropes of smuggling. For them, illicit cross-border trade is a social relationship, an economic cooperation, and a political strategy. So to come back to my PowerPoint, where you live matters, the burden of geography. I called it the burden of geography because this is an expression that many of the smugglers who I met, and also border communities in general, describe the region where they live. Burden of geography. They said to me, we are penalized by geography. So why smuggling have taken roots in the region, in the northeastern region of Algeria? Of course, there are several reasons, but I will give you a few. First of all, the problem of the lack of development programs. State-run development programs have not kept up with the population growth, and the state repeatedly failed to establish a uniform distribution pattern for investment. It doesn't mean there isn't investment. It means there aren't homogeneous. The amount of money, for instance, that is actually poured in a big locality like Tebessa is not the same as the one poured in a small locality like El Wenza or Mdawrouch. The second program is the geographic isolation. And here we have, the high plateau of Algeria, together with the fact that much of it lies as a significant elevation, hampers the marshalling of resources and increase the cost of development project. Just to show you a picture, here is a picture that I took on my Alwenza, and this is the kind of scenery that we can have in the road. So the geographic isolation doesn't help. And then we have, of course, this leads to a poverty rate that is actually, in fact, higher in the Haut Plateau of Algeria. It is actually triple the national rate, and income inequality stands at 27% according to the latest available Gini index. And I'm going to share with you a picture of the kind of of houses that we can find. So you have the choice either to construct a house like this and the state can help you with a few with funds, or you have the opportunity to move in an HLM like this. And so basically, to say it in a few words, the further the capital, Algiers, and the further Tunis as well, the deeper are the socioeconomic imbalances. Actually, in Algeria, in some regions, I have to say the underdevelopment and the disparities, the regional disparities, reached pathological levels. The poverty rate, which lead us, of course, to high levels of unemployment. The borderlands are ill-equipped to absorb the annual entry of young people into the labor market, and unemployment is an endemic problem. And this is why smuggling becomes the occupation par excellence. So, of course, we can talk later about the kind of products smuggled from Algeria. We have this include livestock, especially sheep, auto parts, copper, electronics manufactured by the Algerian brand Condor, perfume, cosmetics, yogurt, makeup. And actually, I wrote a paper on the involvement of women in the smuggling, because they succeeded in carving out a niche for themselves in this activity, and it is called the Smuggler Wore a Veil. It is available on the Carnegie website. So, of course, the king product remains the gasoline. In Algeria, gasoline is a liter of gasoline is up to 3 times lower than in Tunisia. So the stark difference of prices makes ensure the profitability of smuggling gasoline from Algeria to Tunisia. And I will share a few pictures with you. This is the kind of utility vehicles that I met in all my way from Tunis to Qasrin, this kind of Isuzu vehicles. And, there was police everywhere, but nobody bothered to ask the smugglers between codes. And the smuggler earns between, according to my interviews and what they let me know, they earns between $150 and $300 per day. So, and smuggling actually accounts for 75% of the economic activity in the borderlands that I visited. Another picture that I took in a storage house in Algeria, in Qasrin, sorry. This is Algerian smuggled house, and this is when they store it and then they sell it. And this is what I call demonstration of agency. Young people are trying to harness their environment, however inhospitable for economic opportunities. And this is where the concept of borderlands as corridors of opportunities enter into question. While it is true that these people sometimes present themselves as victims of central state, victims being marginalized peripheries, but they are also aware of their possibility, of their agency, of their power to change things, and also of their power to change the borderland into a corridor of opportunity and to take advantage of it. So there is this image that we think that, again, smugglers are bad criminals and the state represented are representatives of law and order. Well, this is not reality. On the ground, the smuggling that occurs there daily and on a large scale reveals that even in a country governed by a quasi-authoritarian regime with a strong centripetal tendencies, fragmentation is very much part of life. So what does it mean? Why? What does it tell us about the state? Well, it tells us that the state has actually what Migdal called the rationality of alternative. Behind state official letting and opening the stretch. Opening the stretch, it's literally the expression that they used in both Algeria and Tunisia for the letting go. They said in Arabic, يفتحوا البطحة, which means opening the stretch. How the official opened the stretch? To let go smuggling. They open it usually for 1 hour, for 2 hours, and then they close it. So why do they do that? Why the official and unofficial? Why is coexisting? Why it is very hard, and actually the lines are blurred between the legal, illegal, licit, illicit? Well, there is a rationality of alternative, as I said, and from the perspective of Algerian borderland communities in Tbissa, Wenza, Dawrouch, Bir al-Ater, and their Tunisian counterpart in Gafsa, in Qasrin, in Haidra, cross-border petty trade, called more often smuggling, as we call it, is considered actually tijara, which means trade. It is considered khadma, which means business. Rarely, actually, people call themselves muharribin. Actually, they make the difference between them and other kind of muharribin, and we can come to this later. So these communities do not consider this illicit activity a transgressive practice. Instead, it is a means of living that involves exploiting the differences in prices and exchange rates on two sides of one border. It is also a platform for economic cooperation, as the level of connectivity between the two populations is very strong. It is finally a chance to enhance life's condition and hope for a less gloomy future in a barren region. Finally, and I will end on this, from the local authorities' perspective, smuggling of these goods, not of drugs and weapons, I'm talking about this kind of smuggling, goods, pasta and gasoline. Smuggling has been part of its economic and security development. On the one hand, it is a safety valve that diminishes economic pressure and by extension, social tension. On the other hand, it is a means to collaborate with the good smugglers to spot the bad ones, the ones involved in drug trafficking, in weapon trafficking, and with jihadist groups. While cross-border smuggling of goods collides with state sovereignty and territorial integrity, it also falls under Algeria's securitization policies to better protect the territory. So, my final word, beyond the popular and the political narrative of smuggling as a criminal activity, in this presentation, smuggling is seen as a different mode of governance imposed by a different geography.
Great, thank you very much, Dalia. That was absolutely fascinating. You've got us off to a very strong start. Next up, we have got Rida Lyammouri, Senior Fellow at the Policy Center for the New South at the Clingendael Institute, and he will present on violent conflict and population movement in the Sahel. So no doubt we'll be touching on similar themes to those that Dalia has just raised. Have you got any slides at all, Rida?
Yes, I'll share with you.
Share them, and if you could put them in in the PowerPoint mode, whatever it is, slideshow mode. That's it.
Oops. Where's the... technical. Okay.
Bear with us, folks. We will
Trying to Okay.
Super.
Can you see it?
Yes, thank you
Okay,
very much.
yeah, apologies, some technical difficulties. Yeah, thanks for having me. I'm here today to speak about an issue that is severely impacted by the current situation in the Sahel. And since 2012, population movement. I'm trying to focus on the population movement rather than the more catchy topics such as drugs, trafficking, human smuggling, etc. But I'd rather focus on something that it's more concerning and relevant to local communities in the Sahel region and who has been severely impacted by ongoing violent conflicts. The most obvious impact of ongoing conflict is forced displacement. There are more than 1 million internally displaced population in Burkina Faso alone, with hundreds of thousands others in Mali and Niger. And if we add Lake Chad and, as you mentioned, Boko Haram conflict, we can confidently say close to 4 million displaced population. They moved within the region and sometimes across the borders into neighboring countries in search of safety, access to basic services such as water, health, education, etc., and to where they can have access to humanitarian aid. Please note that they didn't flee their homes to seek migration further north to the Maghreb or to Europe, but rather to survive. People abandoned their homes because it was the only way to survive, and not with the intention to cross the Mediterranean into Europe. Recent small study that I was able to consult by the UNHCR among displaced population in Burkina Faso, as I mentioned, about 1 million. The majority and overwhelming majority, almost 90%, said that they have no intention to seek migration to reach Maghreb or Europe. And they had rather remain where they are at the refugee camps or displaced population camps, or move back to their homes. Besides forced displacement, the second important impact have been also somewhat visible, which is on the mobility practices in the region. Mobility in the region is a lifestyle and a source of resilience in a harsh economic environment with limited sources of livelihoods. This lifestyle has been severely impacted by ongoing conflicts, but it's not necessarily, has not stopped. Local population that remained in the area adjusted while new patterns of movement emerged. To provide some examples, transhumance, circular and economic migration in the region became limited and risky due to increased violence and imposed security measures, in addition to armed banditry, and ethnic-related violence also has increased in recent years, leaving very limited choices to people who are moving in the region to seek seasonal work. And also they have to think twice about which area they could travel to because of this ethnic tensions that intensified in recent years. Other factors negatively impacted mobility also include state of emergency, security measures imposed by national, regional, and international forces that are operating in the area, imposed curfews, and forbidding the use of motorcycles, which are main practice, the main tool, the main vehicle to use to move and travel in the Sahel region. Some of the new patterns that emerged are related to artisanal gold mining. And this is just one example of some of the patterns. It's a practice that existed for decades in Africa as well, but Mali, Niger, and Burkina Faso cases of artisanal gold mining became of interest and concern in recent years. Despite ongoing conflicts, gold prospectors and seasonal workers in those mines continue to travel to artisanal gold mining to search for work, to search for gold themselves, or to be hired and work directly at some of the gold mines controlled by multiple and sometimes different actors, sometimes legitimate, and also sometimes illegitimate. There is a genuine fear, and I'm not sure if you have all seen some recent reports about jihadist groups, militants generating about $140 million a year from illicit gold mining. So there is a genuine fear that Al-Qaeda and Islamic State affiliated groups are generating income and funds from such a practice. Are they really benefiting and involved? Absolutely. But how much they are benefiting, it's unclear and will be impossible to know. But what we know is this practice has existed before jihadist groups arrived to the region, and they are, and communities living in these areas survive and make their living based on artisanal gold mining. In recent field work on the borders between Niger and Burkina Faso, in conversations with families, they are making a very good living of artisanal gold mining. And to see government and state return to those areas and control those gold mines, it will have a negative impact on those communities because they will lose that income. Because contracts will be awarded to some gold mining companies, and those communities will lose such a practice. This is not to legitimize VEOs and criminal networks' exploitation of natural resources, but this is just to send an alarming concern. Just like cross-border mobility and trade, artisanal gold mining existed before the arrival of these groups, as I mentioned, and these marginalized communities benefited and survived because of these practices, while the respective states, wittingly or unwittingly sometimes, failed to address social, economic, and security issues, and these communities will be left. And they have been left on their own to survive. However, since the deteriorating security situation since 2012, they attracted attention from national and international community for security reasons and for the wrong reasons, and because of the evolving security situation. The narrative coming from those communities is that they feel that they have been neglected for decades, and now that they are perceived as maybe they are the problem. And in a lot of cases, and it is well documented that those communities have been stigmatized and perceived as the problem. And we have seen in recent months acts of abuses, extrajudicial killings, and arbitrary arrests and sometimes executions of civilians perceived or suspected of collaborating with jihadist groups. And the results of the ongoing security situation have led to the closure of the borders, and as I mentioned, the curfews imposed. And these communities continue to be stigmatized, and sometimes from the outside we could keep referring to illicit trafficking, smuggling. Drug trafficking existed and emerged in the region in the 90s and transformed in the 2000s and 2010s. 2010. It continues to this date. There are some reports, but not enough reporting coming out, and not enough information about the types of drugs that are crossing the region. But the practice continues, and the communities in the area continue to suffer from that. I have a couple of recommendations that I would like to share. Is that I think national and regional and international actors should move away from the terrorism narrative. I think by now everyone agrees that the issue in the region is not related to simply to terrorism, but different issues such as governance, injustice, inequality, that have nurtured and continue to create an environment for the terrorist groups to exist and flourish and expand. And now, as we see, they continue to expand even further south to coastal states. Another recommendation is that international community strategies need to match the demands and strategies of the region, or the demands of the region, and things that needs to be addressed, and prioritize what is important right now. And right now, the top priority is addressing issues for the millions of people that are displaced, in addition to also communities remaining in the area that are also in need of physical protection, as well as of a legitimate government. And that brings me to the third recommendation. Legitimacy, I will keep insisting on that. Unfortunately, as I mentioned, injustice and inequality, the state and their allied, either armed groups or local authorities, traditional authorities, they lost the legitimacy among the local population, and it's now it's past the stage of just establishing trust, but now it's also the issue of legitimacy. And this is something that jihadist groups continue to exploit to this day. For example, in recent months in central Mali, with the absence of state, jihadist groups have stepped in to negotiate deals with the communities that remain in the area, and stabilize the area, and agree on different practices so that life continues as normal. And this happened while the state is totally absent in the region. And I will stop here, and looking forward to questions and the discussion.
Great, thank you very much, Rida. Lots of fascinating issues, especially the point that you closed on there, the legitimacy and the efficacy of the state. What does it actually mean to ordinary people on an everyday basis? We've got questions coming in at the bottom. Please keep them coming in, so we've got a good haul for when the Q&A session comes up next, when the next Q&A session arrives. Next up, we have got Abdulhadi Soliman, who is CEO of the Fezzan Libya organization, NGO, which is based in the south of Libya. And he is going to present on Libya as a hub for migration, smuggling and terrorism, an assessment of the post-Qadhafi years based on local perspectives. Libya is obviously a very important cog in the smuggling and the border insecurity mechanism today. Have you got any slides at all, Abdulhadi?
Yes, Jonathan.
Super.
I'll share my screen.
Perfect. Thank you very much. And the floor is yours.
Thank you, Jonathan, and thank you everyone for being here, and thank you for the invitation. As mentioned, my presentation today is on Libya as a hub for migration, smuggling, and terrorism. At the Fezzan Libya organization, we've been conducting a series of focus groups and key informant interviews in the southern region of Libya, looking at to see whether there's been an increase or decrease in migration, smuggling, and terrorism in Libya. Before I move on to answer those questions, I'm going to quick background on Libya, what has been happening over the years, and where we are today. As we all know, for 42 years, Libya was ruled by an authoritarian regime infamous for its brutal dictatorship with its lack of development. However, for 42 years, security was a top priority for Gaddafi that allowed him to rule for so long, but also meant crime, smuggling, and extremism was well maintained. And Libyans obviously revolted against this regime in 2011 with the help of the international community. And since then, Libya has entered a new phase in history, trying to accomplish democracy and see the changes that they all desired. However, due to the lack of political experience in Libya and the increasing foreign interference over the years, Libyans have failed to create a stable government that would allow them to control the country and their resources. And since 2012, the situation has deteriorated and out of the control of the government, with multiple tribal and political conflicts. There's been a rise in extremist activities, human trafficking, and widespread smuggling. And since 2016, Libya has had two governments, an internationally recognized GNA and an interim government voted in by the parliament. We have a parliament that is divided. We have two central banks and multiple armed groups with various agenda. And the recent war in Tripoli increased this political division, and the two warring parties are currently going through a series of negotiations under the UN to try to reach a peaceful solution. And the region, and today I'll be focusing a lot on the southern region of Libya. It's been the most marginalized area in Libya by the centralized government and also by the international community. So there's been little development and there's been a lack of security in the area. And because of this, it has witnessed the most tribal conflicts in the area, especially over resources, and has led to the region becoming this hub for migration and smuggling, and also has allowed extremist groups to use the south as a haven, as a safe haven for them. And going to the first question, looking at migration, did migration increase or decrease after 2011? Simple answer would be yes, it has increased over the years. And what we've been able to do is conduct interviews with some of these smugglers and those that are involved to look at the number of vehicles entering Libya on a daily basis carrying these migrants. And in 2012, we saw maybe 3 to 5 vehicles entering southern Libya on a daily basis. And that has risen over the years, reaching up to 16 and sometimes a lot higher number of vehicles a day. And each vehicle carries around 60 to 70 migrants. The other indicators that we also look at is the use of the public roads by the smugglers. Previously, they use just 1 or 2 roads. Now they have so many roads to use. We also look at the migrant accommodation. There's been an increase in that in the southern cities in Libya. We'll also look at the migrant public worker spots that have also increased over the years. And as you see in this graph, we can see that the migration has increased from 2012 up until 2019. And the main reason for this is the lack of security in Libya, primarily in the southern region, where the southern border is wide open. And this allows smugglers to use numerous routes, even the main roads, to bring in migrants. And they often pay off security officials to pass through certain checkpoints, since there's very little surveillance on the borders. Another reason is the economic grievances. As I said, the South has been marginalized by the government, and this has forced the youth to look for alternatives for income. And so we've seen an increase in the number of youth that are involved in smuggling migrants. Most of them work as drivers, where they can earn between 500 to 1,000 Libyan dinars a day, which is quite a lot for anyone to achieve in one day in Libya, with the average salary of a government paid job is around 750 dinars. However, in 2019, we did see quite a decrease at the beginning of 2019. This was because of strict security measures that we saw when the LNA moved into the south and began operations cracking down on migration. But this only lasted for 4 months before the war in Tripoli in April 2019, where the focus for the LNA was Tripoli, and so migration resumed its normal numbers of around 15 vehicles entering a day. Now, when it comes to smuggling, it's the same as migration. The only difference here is where we're talking about petrol, gas, flour, and wheat, and sometimes weapons that are smuggled outside of Libya, but it's primarily petrol and gas. Things that are smuggled in are usually narcotics and gold from the minings in Niger and in Chad, but mainly Niger. The indicators that we look at here is the number of illegal petrol stations in cities in the south. So Sabha, which is the capital of the south, had 3 petrol stations before 2011. Now they have over 30 petrol stations that smuggle petrol outside of Libya. You also have to look at the price and the availability of petrol and gas. The usual government rate is around 0.15 Libyan dinars. That's now risen to 9 dinars per litre, but the average is around 3 to 4 Libyan dinars. And the reasons for this increase and the decrease are the same reasons as I mentioned with migration. Moving on to terrorism, as you can see in this graph, from 2012 to 2015, we saw a rise in terror activities that were mainly in the eastern region at the beginning, but then moved to the west of the country before moving into the south from 2018. The reason for this increase is simply because of the security and political vacuum in the country, where there's been a lack of cohesion between the military groups and the political parties in Libya. This has allowed the extremist groups to grow and move around freely in Libya. Also, since 2011, Libya's military was drastically fragmented and undermined by the government. There was no clear chain of command, and they were overpowered by other militias and armed groups, making it difficult for them to implement security. However, from 2016, we did start to see a decrease in terror activities. This is mainly because of 2 major battles that took place in Libya. In 2015, when the GNA took on IS with the help of the US, and also the military operations that we saw in the eastern region, saw a drastic blow to extremists in Libya, reducing their numbers and their ability. But also there's been an increase in cooperation with the international community, where the GNA has worked with or the Libyan government has worked with US AFRICOM to conduct airstrikes on terror groups in Libya. And I think since 2011, there's been over 550 drone attacks in Libya, or at least surveillance. This includes surveillance as well. But there's also been an improvement in the structure of the military, more specifically in the eastern region of Libya. And the threats of migration and smuggling and terrorism in Libya is firstly, it's an easy access to Europe for these extremists. They can and have been smuggling individuals into Libya for some time because there's no government control of the borders, and this obviously leaves Europe and the neighboring countries exposed. Extremists are also able to hide out in the southern region of Libya because of the terrain, the mountains and the large desert terrain in the region. They can gather weapons, they can manage terror attacks in various parts of the country safely while they're in the south. Obviously, there's a security threat to neighboring countries where, we've since 2019, we've seen the influx of all these these weapons from their foreign backers, and it's very easy then for these smugglers to get hands of these weapons and smuggle them into neighboring countries. Moving forward, given with the complicated political division in Libya, the international community needs to have a clear political roadmap for Libya that includes all Libyans. I think for some time now, they have been too focused on quick fix solutions that haven't gotten Libya anywhere in terms of achieving peace in the country, along with forming a unified military sector in Libya. But also, one of the things that is overlooked is the root causes of conflict. As I mentioned, economic grievances is the root cause of conflict in Libya, and it's the reason why many youth are forced into smuggling, into migration, just to have an income. Finally, I think over the years, Europe has put a lot of effort in cracking down on migration on the coast of Libya. However, as the south is the hub of migration, that's been ignored over the years. And so more effort needs to be put into the southern region of Libya to crack down on migration and close the southern borders. And that's the end of my presentation. And look for some questions.
And there certainly will be some questions. As soon as we've heard from our last speaker, they are mounting up at the bottom. Please do keep them coming in, and we will get from everybody. Our next speaker is Yasmin Zarloul, who is a DPhil student at Oxford in studying Middle Eastern Studies. And she will present on regional insecurity, mapping out regional flows and unity in the post-independence Maghreb. Have you got any slides for us at all, Yasmin?
Yes, I do. Can you see them?
Yes, we can. If you can put those up. Okay. Could you put it on the slide function? I think they're on. So.
Like this? I'm not sure why it's showing this way.
Yeah, it's kind of playing it as a video. If you go to the bottom of the screen, there should be a little icon.
I can't really see the. Okay, is this working? No. Is it fine if I keep it this way?
Yes, it is. I've got the thumbs up from control. Thank you very much. Over to you.
No worries. So today I'm going to be talking about regional insecurity, mapping out regional flows and unity in the post-independence Maghreb. Initially, I was supposed to kind of tackle a bit more of the historical side of human flows and idea flows in the Maghreb in the period of 1950s to the 1960s, but I've kind of tweaked it to fit this conundrum a bit better. So I'm going to be focusing on the case of the Moroccan-Algerian shared border, and I'm going to be presenting, or at least like thinking through 3 conceptual points to kind of highlight some form of answer to whether illicit activities pose a real threat to the region and Europe, or if security narratives are mere hyperboles. So my first point is around the correlation and interlinkages between different sectors to create security narratives and kind of that blur complex dynamic which happen translocally and regionally. My second point is around the dual concepts of marginalization and resilience exchanges informing the borderlands in the case of Morocco and Algeria. And finally, on this kind of dynamics between daily life practices and the state. So this is the famous picture of the Moroccan-Algerian border, where families sometimes come to salute each other and visitors as well. It's near the town of Oujda. So the current situation at the border between Morocco and Algeria, as many of you know, sees an increased tightening of security and surveillance measures, mostly surrounding issues of smuggling, so both illicit and illicit products, and to a lot smaller extent on the presence of violent groups such as ACME and ISIS. When it comes to analyzing these issues and understanding the role of the borderland, a lot of the scholarship focuses on variables which are mainly around the lack of regional integration, so largely with the fragmentation of the Arab Maghreb Union and its fulfillment of a more regionally integrated region, but due mostly to conflictual bilateral relations between Morocco and Algeria, mostly, and also external actors, agendas such as the EU, as well as political Islam. What I would like to kind of argue here is that these interlinkages and the kind of correlations that are established between the different sectors of economic and human development, as well as extremism within this broad idea of security, put the state into a global agenda of security, which is focused mostly on a view of Maghrebi states as buffer zones. This is not necessarily a new thing because we have seen similar policy of securitization happening since the late 1980s by the European community with programs such as the redirected Mediterranean policy and then later on with the EMP. But generally, I think today when it comes to issues of terrorism, of smuggling and migration, this is put within a bit of a stronger global security where there's a large focus on human security. And this shows the dominance of not only top-down approaches to security, but also to the construction of the Maghreb as a region at crossroads. So where we kind of emphasize the geographical location of the Maghreb between sub-Saharan Africa, the Middle East, and also Europe. And this kind of blurs a lot of the dynamics that happen internally. So I'd like here to kind of focus on the question of what happens if we shift the primary reference of security from this top-down approach to maybe a bit more of a bottom-up complementary approach. And in many ways, I think this raises the role of culture and identity as key elements in the security equation under a framework that either challenges or tries to complement secular projection of security. But it also highlights the importance of considering the developments in their specific historical and contextual spaces. My broader, I suppose, research question, which is a part of my PhD, is also how have borderland communities and their understanding of speciality developed along the post-colonial states and the securitization of the border, again, in the specific case of Morocco and Algeria. And can cross-border exchanges be considered as potential alternative ways of thinking of another form of regional integration that is not necessarily going through institutions? So moving on to my second point, this is here where I kind of try to bring up this idea or like these dual notions of marginalization and resilient exchanges. And I think here, again, it's really important to consider the environment within which communities are being brought into this security apparatus. So as many of you will know, the engagement the rise of illicit activities at the border have been met with strong responses. So this comes in investments in the presence of troops, deployment of police and military at the border, in new technologies, surveillance systems, satellites, CCTV, and so on, as well as the construction of physical barriers, walls and fences. As we have seen in the case of Morocco and Algeria, this has been documented, I think, in 2017. And yet, despite these infrastructures, communities still remain an integral part of border management processes. And we can think of this with, for example, borderland communities being seen as the eyes and ears of Moroccan officials who work at that border, but also maybe in another case of kind of in a more historical way of the Tuareg communities being mobilized for their knowledge of the terrain in more of a southern territories in Algeria. And yet these communities have come into play in this security like apparatuses, or at least to be kind of instrumentalized to some extent in these policies, and a historical long histories of marginalization, and this is both in the colonial and post-colonial periods. So particularly again with the region that I focus on, since Moroccan independence and the Algerian War for Liberation, the shared border has been a space of conflict and marginalization. And I would argue here that actually maybe the lack of documentation and also the lack of archival material on the topic does reflect another form of intellectual border, and in trying to really find out more information about how did this marginalization happen through the pre-independence and post-independence period. But the events that we can kind of pinpoint are, for example, French bombings that happened in 1961, regime monitoring against socialist infiltration, particularly on the Moroccan side, during the Algerian War for Liberation, but also after, as well as the expulsions of 1975, and finally the border closure in 1994. And this trend kind of continues in another form in the post-independence era, which isn't necessarily a physical state violence, but also generally with post-colonial regimes centralizing wealth and power at the center of the territory. So a report by one of the Moroccan ministries kind of states that the border region of L'Oriental, of which Oujda is the capital, is estimated to have roughly a 5% higher poverty rate than the national average. The report dates from 2014. I wasn't really able to find a newer fact. And in light of these marginalism, in light of these events, and also of current kind of marginalization, we still have resilient exchanges. So these kind of happen within, again, another framework of security, and they happen in a context where despite all these measures and despite this like very kind of important, I would say, events in bilateral relations, there was still a constant and uninterrupted exchange between the two sides of the border. And this has been in terms of ideas, so even thinking in the pre-independence period with movements advocating for some form of Maghrebi unity, of proto-nationalism, as well as humans for kinship relations, and finally financial capital. This final slide is, and my final point is mostly to kind of think about how do these borderland communities and their development in a more conceptual framework fit in with the states, and how can we understand these practices. So as we have seen, the increased crackdown on smuggling activities in the Moroccan-Algerian shared border space has led to several internal protests and almost dissent against the governing regimes. We have seen in the case of Morocco, more specifically, protests and sit-ins that were organized in 2016 by families who were protesting the crackdown against fuel smuggling, or at least families who were benefiting from that. And one of them even blocked actually the links between Oujda and Saidia, as well as protests in the eastern town of Rida in 2018. And these kind of protests, maybe the state borderland community relations, kind of shed light on a broader realm of informal economies which exist in the MENA, but also they don't simply exist separately or operate in a completely different way, but actually are very parallel, sustained by state structures and almost operating as potential buffer against economic collapse. On a more kind of bottom-up approach, I would like to put forward the view of these activities, as Dalia has mentioned in her presentation, that although they are framed as acts of defiance to state control and almost acts that kind of deny the full sovereignty of the states on its territory, I think there is some benefit into seeing them as also daily life practices, almost of survival of these communities inhabiting them. And I would like here to put a reference of the late Fatah Daoudi, who has done brilliant work on this, and particularly in the Moroccan-Algerian case. And she kind of looks into the sociological notion of defiance and how it fits in specifically with this. So, sorry, I'm running over time, but just to conclude, and considering these 3 points, I think they kind of prompt us to think and engage with the construction, generally, maybe academically, but also in the policymaking sphere, of what does it mean to have a Maghreb that is constantly depicted as a region at crossroads, and also to kind of think about the different correlations established between different sectors, as well as their implications for these very subjects that actually experience these practices routinely and that are securitized within global narratives of threat making. And thank you very much.
Super, thank you very much. And I was very struck by your idea of intellectual borders, the lack of archival material and the boundaries that they create. We've got a clutch of questions at the bottom. Do please keep them coming in. But given that we've only got half an hour, I'm going to jump straight into them. I will go through them mostly chronological, unless there are some obvious linkages between different questions, in which case I might pose a couple at the same time. Can all the presenters hear me okay? Thumbs up. Good. Right. Well, we've got a first question from Ewan Grant. As was said at the start of the conference today, this is a mixed academic practitioner conference. Ewan is an ex-UK Customs Service intelligence analyst, and his question, I guess, would go most naturally to Abdulhadi, and he asks, how much awareness is there in the UN, the African Union, and the EU assistance programs to the presence of Wagner and its Turkish equivalent in Libya? And where have some of these fighters gone, and where are they likely to go? Any thoughts on that, Abdulhadi?
Yeah, thank you. And yeah, I mean, the UN, AU, and EU are fully aware of the presence of Wagner and Turkish army in Libya. Wagner are mainly present in the eastern and the southern region of Libya, whereas Turkey are in the west. Now, these two groups are heavily entrenched in Libya. Turkey's already have their base in the western region, and Russia occupying other Libyan military bases in the south and the east. And I think because of the level of involvement that they're in and how deep they are in Libya, it's going to be very difficult to just simply ask them to remove, and I don't think they'll be willing to remove anytime soon. And this puts more pressure on Europe, but also puts pressure on the political solution in Libya. And I don't see them. The only way they could possibly be removed is if the Turkey and Russia come to sort of agreement on Libya and actually follow on this demilitarization proposal. But it's highly unlikely.
Okay. Do any of you other panelists have any thoughts on this question about the some of the foreign fighters in Libya? No. Okay. I'm going to move on to the next question. There's no name for this one, but I think it's directed mainly at Dalia and probably Rida, and it is: what is the relationship between people smuggling and politicians? This person has also asked for the PowerPoints. If you drop me an email, whoever you are, then I will try and make sure that they get to you. Dalia, do you want to kick us off? The question is, what is the relationship between people smuggling and politicians? Is the relationship?
Yeah, of course, there is a relationship. Let it be at the local level. I mean, you cannot, for instance, smuggle products from Algeria to Tunisia without the connivance of custom guards and gendarmerie, and hence the connivance of a local politician in the region. But I think this is, again, I think this and this is why my paper was mainly centered on that. I think we had this conception and this concept according, to Max Weber. There is this definition of what is the state and how the state should be. But the definition of Max Weber is an ideal type, a heuristical tool. It is how the state should be and not what the state is. Actually, when you see the representation of the state as at the borderland is totally different. State practices have been and remain fragmented, even sometimes contradictory. And this is not specific to Algeria. You find that in all the borders all over the world. So the state is a contradictory entity in the sense that on the one hand, it is a unified entity with a defined territory and powerful boundaries. But on the other hand, it is a bundle of loose fragments. And this is particularly true in the Algerian-Tunisian case, but it is also true in the Algerian-Malian case, in the Algerian-Moroccan case, and so on and so forth. So of course there is a connivance between politicians, local communities, and so on and so forth. But as I said, this is a rationale of alternative. So if I may add one thing, why? Because I said it earlier, I said, why do actually officials let the smugglers be? And there is this policy of laissez-faire. Because it's a safety valve, but also because smugglers help in keeping the triple dreaded threat, jihadism, weapons, and drugs at bay. Why? So you have this in the narrative, you have, and in the imagination in the borderland community, you have this picture of the good smuggler who smuggles goods, oil, pasta, tomato cans, gasoline, and the bad smuggler, who deals with real illicit products that are weapons, humans, and drugs. And as such, what the Algerian authorities do is that they use the good smugglers to make sure that these are the good guys doing their own business, because there is no other economic alternative. But in exchange, these smugglers keep the jihadists at bay. And if there is any murky operation, they would come and declare like, okay, we saw these cars, we saw these people. As one smuggler put it in Bil Atir, he said jihadism is bad for business. And this is what everybody said. They all said, if we want to continue feed our families, we need to keep away from this. But this doesn't mean, again, that some of them do not go underground and shift for this kind of smuggling, which is actually more lucrative. But this is, again, this is not the majority of the people who I met. The majority of people who I met deal with smuggling of contraband of gasoline and product. So yes, there is a connivance there.
Thank you very much. Rida, did you find the same sorts of things with human trafficking, human smuggling?
Yes, to answer the question, I would focus more on the drug trafficking rather than human trafficking, and especially in the Sahel. I can agree about the relationship between politicians and drug traffickers, and I would add to that security forces. The drug trafficking will not exist and will not flourish in the region without the support and the relationships that drug traffickers has with corrupt politicians and security forces. Recent panel of experts, the UN panel experts on Mali, clearly identified key individuals from the military, the Malian military, that were involved in the drug trafficking, and other politicians, other also members of armed groups that are part of the peace accord. And I will always say this, that it's mind-blowing to not just to me and the observers in the region, but also to local population in Mali and the Sahel in general, where they see individuals who are known to be involved in drug trafficking. They continue to be influential. They continue to be backed by the politicians in the capitals, and nothing has happened to them. They even sometimes, even during the occupation of northern Mali in 2012 by the Islamists, they collaborated because of its convenience at the time. They collaborated with jihadist groups that occupied northern Mali. So it's a very murky, dirty relationship between all the actors involved, and this relationships continue to this day. And it goes back to my recommendation when we talk about the international community priorities and focus on the issues in the Sahel. And this is one of the main issues when we talk about corruption. The mandate, for example, of Barkhane forces focuses on terrorism, but they will not touch drug traffickers or other criminal activities. I had conversations with people in Gao last year when I was there, and they said the area is safer when Barkhane forces are not in the area, because what they do, they chase jihadist groups, but they don't chase criminal groups. And the people are suffering from armed banditry, in addition to individuals involved in drug trafficking, which has contributed to division between communities and contributed to stability in Mali and continue to in the Sahel region in general.
Great, thank you very much. A slight change of focus and a question for Yasmin, and it's perhaps a little bit unfair. You mentioned about how border communities, how a border community along a closed border, as exists between Algeria and Morocco, defines itself. How is that different from those communities living along an open border, say the Algerian-Tunisian border? Have you found any marked differences in terms of how these populations perceive of themselves and their nationality?
Thank you for the question. I haven't actually properly looked into comparative perspectives of the two, although I think that would be really interesting. But perhaps I would say that this is also a question that I would like to look into a bit more as I go into the whole PhD journey. But I think intuitively, I would probably say that in the case of Morocco and Algeria, there is still a very strong kind of role played by perhaps a collective memory of like violence. And I think the way that maybe this has shaped a different perception of the way that not only that the border populations understand themselves, but also understand their relation to the state and the places in which they kind of evolve and live. But I would also say that, I mean, there has been an intensification of the border controls after not just 1994, but later in 2012. And I think this must lead to some form of like constant change of how these populations perceive themselves, that also is not just like kind of fixed in time, but also is very much dependent on how they navigate these security issues along the border. And this might be different to how communities would understand themselves and their identities in an open border context. I hope this answered the question, but yeah, it's super interesting, and I really am hoping to look into this more, to this comparative aspect in the Maghreb.
No, thank you very much. On now, we've got a question for Abdulhadi from Sir Derek Plumley. He says, you spoke of the need for a long-term political roadmap in Libya under the auspices of the United Nations. How realistic is movement towards this now in the shadow of COVID and with regional powers dug in, supporting their local proteges?
It's a good question, and I think, with COVID, the only obstruction there is that, the UN isn't going to be able to travel freely in Libya. The warring parties are unable to travel freely. However, they still do travel, and most of the meetings that they do they take place in Tunisia or other parts of Europe. And I think, obviously, with the regional powers dug in, it's going to be more difficult. However, the way that the UN has been going about these issues is, quick fix solutions, now is certainly not going to help Libya at all. Whatever happens, whatever the situation is, they need to have a long-term goal where they can actually try to include Libyans from all parts of the country rather than selecting just a few. And this is the problem with the UN sort of process that it's been doing. It hasn't been very open on the people that they select, and this has obviously angered a lot of people on the ground. And so, even though before the COVID they were visible or present in the country, they weren't visible or they weren't transparent in their sort of process and who they were selecting in these dialogue sessions or these reconciliation efforts they've been trying to do. And so yes, these are difficulties, but it's not an excuse for them to sort of try to continue with these sort of quick fix solutions.
Thank you very much. And while we have you on the line, we've got another Libya question here for you. And it is, what is the state of play with regard to the expulsions on the border between Libya and Niger? Migrants coming from Niger on the border with Libya are known to be sent back into the Sahara without money, without water, without food. Is this something that you've come across at all? Can you comment on that?
So could you repeat that? Just lost it.
The question is, migrants are coming from Niger into Libya, and they're being sent back over the border into the Sahara without adequate provision, without any money or food or water. Is this something that you have come across?
I have, but it's not in large numbers. I mean, most of this is incoming rather than outgoing. And so the only outgoing is from the UN organizations such as IOM, who help to transport migrants back outside of Libya. But their bigger problem is actually that once they enter Libya, they stay there for a very long time. And if they don't have enough money to pay for the remainder of the trips from one village in the south to another village, another town, to the main city, to the capital, then unfortunately migrants are either tortured or killed, and some are even thrown in deserts inside Libya rather than even in Niger or the bordering countries.
Great, thank you very much. I've got another question for Dalia, so I'm glad you're back, and it is on conducting research. It's from Sarah Perrott, and she asks, it's really complicated to conduct field work as a social scientist in Algeria, even when you have an Algerian passport. How have you managed to conduct your field work with the Algerian authorities? Did you have to ask specific authorizations, or did you conduct the research informally.
Yeah, it's true. That's totally true. Actually, it is hard to do research in general in Algeria, be it as a social scientist, as a politist, as as a journalist. It's very hard. It used to be harder during the civil war when everybody was suspicious, and even after the civil war. But I conducted my field work. For instance, my PhD thesis was on a very challenging topic, and actually I wrote an academic piece called doing or challenging fieldwork in Algeria, working on massacres, because back then I worked with former jihadists to answer this very difficult question of how normal individual between quotes turn into devil. So I had to meet former jihadists, but also victims of massacre and so on and so forth. And as a scholar at Carnegie today, I work on different thematics. I work on the military, I work on the Islamists, I work on the borders. When it comes to the borders, I am Algerian myself. I am an Algerian citizen. I travel with my Algerian passport. And as such, I do not have to ask an authorization to talk to people. I took my car, I took a driver, I took my brother as well. And we traveled by car from Algiers to Mdawroush, which is almost 700 kilometers. We stopped in different regions in Stif, in Qsentina, in Bir al-Ater, in Al-Wanza, and I would just go and talk to people. I do not see, the problem. As long as the people want to talk to you, you don't need an authorization. When dealing with the institution, it's a different matter. I remember writing, for instance, this big paper on the feminization of the Algerian military and the integration of women within the national liberation, the national army. And I asked for the Ministry of Defense help because I needed archives, I needed data, and they refused. What was funny though, is that I received at the Carnegie Middle Center a fax. Yes, fax do exist. And the MDN in Algeria uses them. I received a fax in Arabic saying how wonderful was my study and thank you for this. Why they simply refused to talk to me. So I would say as a researcher and an Algerian who would advise, sociologists and political scientists to go do field work, because to be honest, I'm not the kind of researcher who can just only do desk research. It doesn't work this way. We need to meet people. We need to feel the terrain. When I went to Qasrin, for instance, I was amazed by how people were nice to me, and how people were like, "Ukht al-Jazairiyya, the sister is Algerian. Of course, you are you are home. We can talk to you." Of course, some people said no, and I don't insist. But many officials actually from the gendarmerie or the customs talk to me off record. I will never put in jeopardy my contacts. I will never say the name. Sometimes even if I met them in Bir al-Ater, I would say I met them in Dawroush, So I have to respect that. But I would really advise people to go and, to take full courage and responsibility, especially if you are an Algerian citizen. There is no authorization to have you. You walk on the street, you want to talk to people. This is also what I did during the Hirak when it started in February 2019. I took a plane ticket from Beirut to Algiers, and I stayed there 25 days, and I covered the Hirak. I talked to normal citizens, to ordinary citizens. I marched with them on the street. So, I think this is what we can do. Of course, I am not saying that my study is exhaustive or my study is super complete. I am not reaching for what we call in French la généralisation empirique. I am studying world border. I am not also the kind of researcher who does 200 interviews, because I know some people do 200 interviews. I don't know how they manage this, but I am the kind to do 15 interviews, very well targeted, and then go home and, take back the notes and write and analyze. So it is difficult, but it is not impossible. Also, one final note, it depends on the period. I've known fieldwork in Algeria that was super tough. Even my contact would tell me, no, Dalia, this is a bad moment, because there is some kind of periods when there is paranoia, when people are scared. It is actually a bad moment. right now with all, you know, the COVID-19, the referendum of November 1st, the Hirak going back and taking back to the street. So it depends also on the time, on the period.
Thank you very much. And that was cautiously encouraging and very, very useful. I've got a question for Rida, and then I've got another one for all four of you. This is from Jahain. We'll start with a question for Rida, which is about artisanal illegal gold mining. And they ask, what's the prospect of development of that in Algeria? And is the government worried about it?
I personally don't focus on artisanal gold mining in Algeria, so I cannot speak to that. But I can, from my experience on the Sahel, I think the state has to think twice about it before trying to control the artisanal gold mining. For instance, if we look at, let's look at northeastern Niger on the borders with Libya. When the gold mines were discovered in 2013, 2014, it was kind of like a lifesaver to a lot of people, a lot of youth in the area with the different the uranium facilities closing in Arlit and Agadez, with the crackdown on migration industry later on in 2015 and 2016. So I know a lot of people who converted from being human smugglers to gold mining, to artisanal gold mining, also because of the security situation and the absence of tourism. So a lot of tour guides who were working in tourism industry converted also to artisanal gold mining. So the Nigerian states they closed one site, but they have not closed another major one, which is on the borders with Algeria, because they know the impact. They know if they do that, that's going to have a significant impact of local youth, and not just in Niger, but people are coming also from neighboring countries. And the same thing in Burkina Faso, and now in Mali with new gold mines discovered in northern Mali. And it goes back to the point earlier about migration. It's both ways. I think people also started to die traveling from Niger to Libya, started to die in the desert because they started taking dangerous routes because of the crackdown on migration, especially when the European Union intervened and pushed the Niger to establish laws to crack down on smugglers. So smugglers started to take more dangerous and risky routes, and that's why we have seen a little bit of spike between 2016 and 2018, the number of migrants dying in the desert. But as Abdulhadi mentioned, it's a small number compared to people dying that have died on the Mediterranean.
Okay. Thank you very much. Jahain's second question is for all four of you, and perhaps we'll start with Dalia and work our way across. The question is, are we seeing a shift in overall policy of North African states regarding migration from sub-Saharan Africa, and how is this informed by Europe? So are we seeing a shift in overall policy of North African states regarding migration from sub-Saharan Africa, and in what ways and to what extent is Europe informing, driving, shaping that change in policy? Dalia, do you want to kick us off?
Yes, well, I think at least when it comes to the Algerian case, the Algerian government has always played these two cards, you know, terrorism and migration. So the European Union has actually to back up the authorities if they want us to take hold on the migrants, but also to be the guardians of les gendarmes, as they call themselves, les gendarmes du Sahel et de la région, the gendarme of the Sahel and the region. And hence the Algerian authorities has been playing this card for a while. They have also been playing card, you know, be it of the migrants of the Sahara or the Haraga, that are, you know, those people who take boats to leave from the shores of Algeria to reach Europe. Of course, the European Union is not, I would say, and I would say it bluntly, the European Union has no interest right now with the COVID-19 and the fall of the GDP of every important European country, starting by France and Germany, has no interest whatsoever in human rights. And hence, it is going to focus on stability and security first. If this means that it needs to back up regimes, North African regime that has been, cracking down on their population or, has been violating human rights, it will do it. And my take on this is that 2020, 2021 is going to be a very important year for North Africa. We have this huge Algeria behemoth that is actually witnessing a very difficult transition. We have Tunisia, the happy child of the Arab Spring, that is also struggling. And we have, of course, the Libyan neighbor that has been struggling for years. And we have all these, related questions that are migration, haraga, terrorism, and so on and so forth. So what is the European Union going to do? Well, I bet that the European Union, again, is going to pour money, turn a blind eye to human rights, and just keep stability at any case. And maybe this is me being pessimistic today, but this is what I think.
Thank you very much. Rida, your thoughts? Are you in concurrence with Dalia?
Yes, I think it's been problematic. I think the European Union policies in regards to migration have been problematic in the Sahel region because of this assumption that they can control it. They can control the movement of people from the Sahel to North Africa, to Maghreb, and then to Europe. This is a practice that existed for decades and have intensified with the Libyan crisis. But what they have neglected in their policies, and we can say with confidence that have failed in Niger because of the negative impact that it had on the local communities and people in Niger. As I mentioned, and that's why in my recent study, and I shared briefly with you the findings, is that we cannot just look at migration when we're looking at the issues of traveling and movement in the Sahel, because, and as I mentioned, the majority the people moving in the area remain in the area. They don't necessarily, they're trying to, if they're moving from Burkina Faso to Niger or to Mali or coming from Cote d'Ivoire, they are staying in the area to search for work. And I have met in Gawa, I have met people working in construction from Senegal, from Cote d'Ivoire, from West African countries that are working in the area. People travel from one market to another. That's what they do. That's what they do to conduct business and trade. Talking about Yasmin's point about the border communities, people go across the border. To them, the border doesn't exist. They go. That's how they conduct trade with their families and friends, and it's a social also aspect to it during the local markets. That's when they interact with others. That's where they share information. There is that social cohesion and resilience among those communities. And that's why I think the European Union policies failed in Niger and the Sahel region in general, and has to rethink its perception of migration in the area.
Great, thank you very much, Rida. Yasmin, your thoughts? Are the policies changing of North Africa's countries?
Yeah, I mean, I completely agree with what Dalia and Rida have just said, but I would like to just maybe add another point about the specific case again of Morocco. And I think in this case, I mean, we saw that there was heavy crackdowns on like sub-Saharan migration into the country, which was confirmed to some extent by at least by the Ministry of Foreign Affairs. I think in 2018 there was a statement like this, but it was also heavily kind of criticized by human rights organizations. And I think in terms of like EU policy, when it comes to policing or like regulating these flows, really put the country in a bit of an uncomfortable position. I think it's going to be really a challenge to not only manage whatever security the country sets for itself, but also to balance between internal discontent with the way that the migration flows have been handled generally in the country, and also to well, kind of respect this new turn towards sub-Saharan Africa. I think for Morocco it will be quite a challenge to balance all these forces and regulate it in a.
Well, thank you very much. And Abdulhadi, it's Libya is obviously a far more complicated situation.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, it's very complicated, and it's not like Tunisia or Algeria or Morocco, which is a more stable government. And simply, you know, Libya doesn't have a policy towards migration. It's a failed state. However, Europe does seem to have some sort of policy towards Libya when it comes to migration. And for years, their plan or their policy was to simply just to prevent migrants leaving Libya and entering Europe. They weren't really interested in what happens in Libya, what the migrants go through in Libya for the past few years. And only Italy has been mainly interested in the migration file in Libya. They too have been concentrating heavily just on the coast in the western region of Libya. But I think in the past year or so, they have changed their attention more towards the south. Recently, I think they've realized now that, you know, no matter what they do in the coast, as long as the migrants are coming into the south, then the threat is always there. And they've changed their attention towards the south a bit more. Recently, they formed this tribal council with all the tribes in the south in order to solve all these tribal conflicts in the region that's, you know, preventing the government or anyone putting a stop on migration. And so, yeah, it's only Europe that is really sort of changing its policy on migration rather than Libya itself.
Great, thank you very much. I think we are out of time, unless I'm told otherwise. Yes, we are out of time. I haven't been told otherwise. It's been confirmed. Thank you very much for your presentations and for your answers to the questions. And thank you very much to everybody who asked a question. And I'm sorry to those people who asked questions and we haven't been able to get to. If you want to follow up with that, please feel free to contact me or try and contact our presenters directly. I'm sure they'll be interested in your thoughts. Thank you very much. Please imagine rapturous applause for your talks.
Okay, great. Thank you a lot, John. So we had a very, very long day. So I'm going to keep the final remarks of the conference, the wrapping up, the closing very short. I want to focus on two things really only, that is thank yous and how to get involved with the Institute of Middle Eastern Studies at King's College, if you want to. So I'll share my screen just for you guys to see. Basically, thank yous, how to potentially get involved. Really massive thank you on behalf of the MENA Research Group and the Institute of Middle Eastern Studies in general. Nega and I want to thank all of our chairs, the keynote speaker, all of our presenters. I think throughout the three panels, all presenters really stuck to their allocated time, which is a rarity at most academic conferences. So I think that speaks for our exceptional panelists, because that left us a lot of time for Q&A. And even though we couldn't meet in person, I think there was a lot of audience engagement, which we really enjoyed. Overall, I think we had excellent presentations. I know that our panelists joined us from Tunis, from Rabat, from Beirut, from Washington, DC, from Edinburgh and various locations in London. So also across different time zones. Some of them needed to get up really early to give their 10-minute presentation. So thank you to all of you. And then another thank you to everyone who joined us today. We had a great audience, an engaged audience, and also our audience was captured various regions of this world. So I'm still a bit sad that we couldn't meet in person, and there will be no socializing now amongst the panelists and everyone who participated. But due to our online format, I think a lot of people could join who might not have made it to London. So there were definitely benefits to that. And now finally, I want to, similar to what John said already, I really want to encourage everyone who's interested to follow the work of the Institute, follow the work of the members of the Institute. And we have a newsletter announcing forthcoming events. If you're new to King's and want to get involved, please reach out, as we also have some internal events. And then especially for PhD students, we have the Middle East and North Africa Research Group, when again, I keep regular activities going as well. So you can find the King's Institute of Middle Eastern Studies and the MENA Research Group on social media. We have a homepage, and honestly, I tried it. If you Google King's College London Middle East, you will find all of the right sites and contact email addresses, etc. coming up. So thank you again, everyone who participated. Thank you so much to King's College communications team as well. We have school, we had people from different schools, so from the School of Politics and Economics, from the School of Security Studies, from the admin side, Lizzie and Dan, and many others who were working in the background throughout the entire day. And I think we only had minor technical glitches. So I'm very happy about that. Thank you, everyone. And we'll hopefully see you at upcoming events of the Institute. Thank you.
Thanks, everyone. Bye.
Bye.